The eyes of the world remain riveted on Gaza, on the images and testimonies of Palestinians going home, on the stories of resilience. The looming issue, what comes next?
Good afternoon, everybody.
Donald Trump's team takes over the White House briefing room and takes a shot across the bow of the press corps in D.C. Plus, the blockbuster game that has thundered out of China, while teaching Beijing a thing or two about how to showcase Chinese culture. Two weeks into the ceasefire in Gaza, news has been pouring out, developments that have been playing out live across Arabic language media. Displaced Palestinians, more than 500,000 of them, returning home to the northern end of the Strip, having survived war, siege, and starvation, searching through the rubble for what remains of their past lives. The images of their return and the Hamas fighters there to greet them amount to proof that the Netanyahu government's stated war aims have not been met, and that is not going down well with certain segments of Israeli society. Right-wing media outlets there are calling it a disaster, a humiliation. Far-right voices and politicians are demanding a renewed offensive. Hamas, meanwhile, is seizing the moment, making the most of it through its messaging. The question that remains is the one on the mind of every Palestinian in Gaza. How long will this ceasefire last, and what will happen if it doesn't?
Israel wanted a live-streamed genocide and a live-streamed Nakba. But what it got was a live-streamed mass return of displaced Palestinians. The historic images of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians going back to their communities have a great significance, not just for Palestinians, but for all of humanity.
It is the opposite of an exodus, an influx of Palestinians back to northern Gaza, a place the Israelis said these people would never see again, a land Israeli forces have pulverized and left in ruins. It makes for an odd backdrop for scenes of jubilation, family reunions taking place amidst the rubble that everyone knows conceals even more dead bodies. But for Palestinians, displacement is nothing new. It runs in the family and goes back generations, 3/4 of a century, all the way to 1948.
That notion of return is really at the core of the Palestinian struggle. And so when we see these people, despite all odds, display this kind of resilience and resolve to stay on the land, it's really inspirational. But it's also bittersweet because 92% of homes in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. And they're also going back to recover the bodies of loved ones that have been trapped under the rubble. So this moment really holds a variety of emotions, but I think it's a moment that will be remembered for a very long time.
The images that we've been seeing coming out of Gaza in recent days really speak to the resilience of Palestinians who have risked everything, put their lives on the lines to be able to remain on their own land. And this, of course, coming at a time when we continue to hear efforts regarding the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza.
Including from none other than U.S. President Donald Trump.
We're talking about probably 1.5 million people, and we just clean out that whole thing.
That would be illegal under international law, which forbids ethnic cleansing. And Trump's musings have even been mocked within Israel. The liberal newspaper, Haaretz, which has produced some questionable reporting over Gaza, nevertheless published this scorching editorial, saying at this rate, Trump is likely to propose that Gazans be launched voluntarily into space and settle Mars. Haaretz is the closest thing to an outlier in an Israeli mainstream media space that has lurched to the far right, where outlets like Channel 14 are putting out content like this, boasts about destroying Palestinian homes in Gaza.
אתם לא מבינים מה זה להפיל בית 7 קומות, 6 קומות, 5 קומות, אחד אחרי השני. זה כאילו באמת אומנות.
תגיד לי, כמה בתים הורדת?
אני ממוצע בשבוע שאני נמצא זה 50 בתים.
There was a comment on Israeli Channel 14.
אני יכול להגיד לך שלוחמים שיצאו מציר נצרים יצאו בדמעות ואמרו שהם פשוט מרגישים שכל מה שהם עשו במשך למעלה משנה ברצועת עזה יורד לטמיון.
This shows how pathetic this genocidal campaign has been from the beginning. A campaign of mindless revenge aiming at the expulsion of millions of Palestinians, but Palestinians did not allow that to happen. And they also achieved a spectacle that will be engraved on the walls of Palestinian memory forever, of setting a precedent for mass return.
They're really incensed by it, that Palestinians, despite facing 15 months of constant bombardment, of losing over 100,000 probably Palestinians in the process, that they're returning. They were promised the destruction and elimination of Hamas and the expansion of Israel into more Palestinian territory. And in Gaza, that hasn't been the case. A lot of Israelis feel betrayed by the ceasefire, particularly those on the far right. They feel like everything they've fought for in the last year and a half was for nothing. That's a very hard pill for Israeli society to swallow.
There is no ceasefire being discussed in Israel. The public discourse around it is of a hostage deal. And the difference is that a hostage deal is meant to return the captives and not meant to end the war. In the beginning of the war, we heard a lot of talk about the two objectives of returning the captives and defeating Hamas as being possible together. And I think what has developed is an understanding that they are in fact mutually exclusive. And that is creating big cleavages within Israeli society.
Hamas, what is left of the movement, wants to contribute to that. After the ceasefire, it reasserted itself in the armed displays of defiance, intended to show it has not been defeated, that it is still in control, and by helping the displaced find their way through a post-war wasteland. Optics matter, and one measure of Hamas's gradual re-emergence has been in the phased release of Israeli captives. Most were carefully choreographed, and Hamas camera operators filmed them moment by moment, with Israeli female captives paraded in military uniforms to remind whoever was watching that before those women were kidnapped, they were soldiers. All taking place on a stage decorated with messages in Arabic, Hebrew, and English that Hamas wants Israelis and the outside world to see.
The captive releases have really been about displaying Hamas's resilience and presence in Gaza. Netanyahu promised the Israeli people, he promised the Americans that he would eradicate Hamas from Gaza, from the face of the earth. And he hasn't achieved those goals. And what Hamas is doing with these orchestrated releases is really showing its power, showing its presence in Gaza.
There were certainly a lot of images and stories in the Israeli media about Hamas reappearing and reestablishing itself, helping people rebuild and find places to live. Those images are often presented to the Israeli as a cynical attempt by Hamas to demonstrate its presence and prove that it hasn't been defeated. But I think there's something more fundamental there, which is that if they do want to reestablish control, then they will need to help the people whose lives and homes have been destroyed in this war. So it may very well have moved from an active war footing to one of trying to reestablish governance.
What we've essentially seen is an escalation in the war of narratives. That on the one hand, you have the Israeli leadership that has been saying that they seek to completely eliminate Hamas, to eradicate it within Palestinian society. And on the other hand, we have these images that stand in stark contrast to those claims, that they have simply failed in their mission to completely destroy this movement, and that it continues to be a very visible presence in Palestinian society.
Journalists based in Gaza who risked their lives to document 15 months of death and destruction and survived while seeing so many of their colleagues killed are part of this story. Many have been seen reunited with their families, sometimes live on the air. Touching moments often broadcast across the Arabic-speaking world. Some of those journalists work for Al Jazeera, a network the Netanyahu government banned in Israel 8 months ago. But Israeli audiences, politicians included, have been watching Al Jazeera's output for coverage of the release of Israeli captives in Gaza.
אנחנו רואים, זה השידור הישיר של ערוץ אל-ג'זירה הקטרי, כרגע ממש ממרכז רצועת עזה.
For months, Israeli media, Israeli politicians were in a state of denial. The assault on journalism, the assault on Al Jazeera was part of this process of denial. Rather than grapple with those realities, with its declining reputation, Israel went and shut down the voice of truth. And now that the war has failed to achieve its objectives, they are going to wake up and grapple with everything that they have been trying to deny.
To Washington now, where this past week journalists were given a taste of the kind of treatment they can expect from President Donald Trump's new administration. Ryan Coles has been following this story.
The first press briefing of the second Trump presidency took place fronted by a 27-year-old, Caroline Leavitt, the youngest ever White House press secretary. And right off the bat, she said a few things straight.
We know for a fact there have been lies that have been pushed by many legacy media outlets in this country about this president, about his family, and we will not accept that. We will call you out.
There had been some speculation as to possible changes to the briefing room seating plan. That's the list of media outlets to get a permanent seat, and importantly, how close to the action they get to sit. Instead, the White House will be inviting TikTokers, bloggers, and podcasters to sit next to the podium in spots usually occupied by staffers, a recognition, perhaps, of the role those kinds of voices played in President Trump's campaign. One of the more attention-grabbing parts of the briefing was this, regarding cuts to foreign aid.
That there was about to be 50 million taxpayer dollars that went out the door to fund condoms in Gaza. That is a preposterous waste of taxpayer money.
That was later repeated by the president himself before conservative media picked it up.
Do you think Hamas wears condoms? No. They make condom bombs. Hamas inflates the condoms, straps on an explosive, and floats them into Israel. It's a dual-use technology.
In fact, the story is entirely baseless. U.S. government figures show that of the $60 million of foreign aid spent on reproductive health around the world, only $7 million of that was spent on condoms, and not a penny of it went to Gaza.
Thanks, Ryan. To China now, where the country's entertainment industry is undergoing a transformation. That includes the world of video games. Chinese games have long had a reputation for being low quality, quick turnarounds, games you might play on your phone. About 6 months ago, that changed with the release of Black Myth: Wukong. Black Myth is a blockbuster of a game that taps into Chinese folklore, taking a classic 16th century novel, reimagining it, and turning it into a stunning, immersive, modern-day experience. And that's what makes Black Myth revolutionary, the way it bridges Chinese mythology and contemporary gaming. The Listening Post's Tarek Nafa now on the video game that indicates China's gaming industry has caught up with its competitors in Japan and the West, and how politicians in Beijing are reaping the rewards of that.
Black Myth: Wukong is a game deeply rooted in Chinese traditional culture, religious beliefs, and mythological stories. It's incredibly engaging because it faithfully recreates the mythical figure Sun Wukong from the novel Journey to the West. This character and his story are well known to every Chinese person, regardless of age or gender. I've known the story of Journey to the West since childhood, but when I played Black Myth, I was transported back into that story. So for me, it's not just an old story, it's a new experience.
The runaway success of Black Myth: Wukong rests in its ability to reanimate a story first told in China 500 years ago. Players are immersed in Chinese mythology, a world of heroes, deities, spirits, and demons. They're taken on a journey that includes real places, lifelike renderings of temples and shrines. For Chinese gamers who are used to spending time in a world typically dominated by stories from the West, it feels more like home. For players abroad, it is a portal into Chinese culture, and that's what makes it a breakthrough for China's gaming industry.
What's really exciting about the game Black Myth Wukong is its blend of cutting-edge technology, intricate gameplay, and really deep cultural storytelling. So when the game was first launched, back in August of 2024, it sold millions of copies within days and generated billions of dollars in values. That's huge. And you know, it's not just popular in China, where 70% of its sales is based. It's also getting traction globally, which is a major milestone for Chinese game developers.
Black Myth's popularity earned it the title of China's first AAA game. A AAA game typically has a big budget, a big team behind it, and a long production timeline. It is a marker of a game's quality, its graphics, gameplay, and storytelling. These are not the kind of games that Chinese developers have been known to produce.
Chinese game studios have generally focused on games with shorter development cycles, lower investments, and faster returns. Those games have shorter play times and quicker monetization, but they don't deliver rich, memorable, and profound experiences. This explains why Black Myth Wukong as a AAA game has sparked so much discussion. It challenges the stereotype of China as a producer of inferior games.
The Chinese gaming industry, from the development side, has been really focused on mobile games. For the last 15 years, China has the biggest mobile market in the world. More than 90% of revenue in gaming in China comes from mobile games, and in particular from free-to-play mobile games that then monetize through microtransactions and ads. So Black Myth Wukong was really a departure for that, because it's a game that's absolutely not concerned about being free to play. It's a game made primarily for computers and for consoles.
It shows that Chinese developers can actually compete with usually Western or Japanese players in a space that's highly competitive. So this is really I would say, a coming to age moment for a lot of Chinese gaming developers, and it shows the tech progress underway and also how fast China is catching up to global leaders in this industry.
China has not always been the most hospitable place for game developers. There is a societal perception that video games are harmful for young people. That has an effect on policy, including limits on playtime for children. There is also strict government control and regulation of games production. Before a game goes to market, it is screened for explicit and violent content, as well as material that could be at odds with the official narratives coming out of Beijing. Black Myth, with its focus on Chinese folklore, aesthetics, and architecture, has a message the government can get behind.
When we talk about the Chinese gaming market, we definitely need to talk about the regulations, and we should not use euphemisms. There's definitely censorship, but there's a misconception that the government will get involved in every aspect of entertainment in China. Black Myth Wukong had investments from the local government, from Hangzhou, but I don't think the government, local authorities, ever sat down with them and said, okay, you need to do this or you need to do that.
The Hangzhou government was a big supporter of the developer behind the game Black Myth Wukong in terms of providing policy support, investment funding, and actually reserving extra studio place for the game studio to grow. So I think the government is coming to this realization that gaming is not just a pastime, it's actually a strategic industry. We see gaming hardware sales goes up because of Wukong's success, as people are purchasing hardware in order to play the game better. And also local tourism, as gamers rush to the sites on which the game's settings are based, especially in the Shanxi province. So this new model of Game Plus economy is getting a lot of traction in policy discussions in China.
This government support is not just about funding. We can also see it in terms of narrative. After the game's release, several official media outlets in China, like People's Daily Online, endorsed Black Myth Wukong. This demonstrates that the game aligns with official narratives, cultural directions, and societal expectations. The game transcends entertainment. It became a medium for China's cultural diplomacy. That cultural influence outside China has always been challenging for the government to achieve, but Black Myth Wukong demonstrates this potential.
China's diplomatic approach has shifted in recent years, moving away from what was once called wolf warrior diplomacy, a term inspired by an action movie, Wolf Warrior, which came out in 2017. The film's special forces hero seemed to reflect the more assertive, sometimes aggressive language of Chinese diplomats. But that approach has since changed. Chinese officials have embraced a softer, more conciliatory tone, a vision centered on cooperation and understanding.
中方愿意同美国新政府一道，在两国元首的战略引领下，本着相互尊重、和平共处、合作共赢的原则。
There does seem to be a shift, at least on the margin, from the aggressive style of wolf warrior diplomacy to a softer, more engaging style of cultural diplomacy. And in that sense, Black Myth fits this new tone perfectly. It's not about confrontation. It's not about China, taking on the world. It's more about sharing part of Chinese culture. And precisely because that kind of soft power aspect of the game is not heavy-handed, it feels authentic. That actually contributed to the game's appeal as a cultural product.
Globally, there's a lot of attention on how China promotes its culture, especially with the wolf warrior style of diplomacy in recent years. This approach, which presents Chinese culture in a very forceful, hyper-masculine manner, has been met with a rather unaccommodating attitude from Western governments and media, which is understandable. Black Myth Wukong represents a more subtle and indirect way of showcasing Chinese culture. This is in fact a very sophisticated form of cultural communication. It allows Chinese culture to enter the global player's vision in a very natural way. It's a very successful example of the ongoing effort to tell China's story well.
And finally, this past week, Ali Abu Neama, the head of the online news outlet Electronic Intifada, was arrested in Zurich, jailed for 2 days, and then deported from Switzerland. He was in the country having been invited to speak at a conference there about Palestine. Post-arrest, Abu Neama's communications with the outside world were cut off. He was interrogated without legal representation, and he says police accused him of offending Swiss law, but he was never charged with the crime. Now, Switzerland makes a big deal about its political neutrality. It is how the country brands itself. And the authorities there went after Abu Neama during the same week that Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog spoke at the World Economic Forum in Davos, despite the fact that Herzog is among the Israeli politicians accused of inciting genocide in Gaza. It is a reminder, as if we needed one, that the crackdowns on criticism of Israel and its atrocities against Palestinians are still happening, even in countries that are allegedly neutral.